Just making sure it's recorded. Thank you all for coming again. All right. So today, men are suffering. We don't seem to care. And as a man myself, I can recognize inequality and harm and even death for men today. And we don't seem to talk about it. So first, I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying that these issues are more important than in other groups or in other genders, just that they're important. And because they're important, we should talk about them. So what I want to talk about are just some issues that disproportionately affect men, why I think that they're happening, and some things that we can do that can try and help. So what I mean by suffering, I'm talking about issues that disproportionately affect men, either mentally, emotionally, or physically. But ones I want to focus on more importantly are ones that affect the loss of life. So and those things are suicide rates, workplace fatalities, and lack of resources in a crisis. So for suicide rates, the CDC did a study from 2009 to 2017 that between men and women, showing that the suicide rate is 3 to 1, male to female. An independent organization, Statista, compiled all reported workplace fatalities in 2001 in the United States and found that 4,800 men died in the workplace compared to the 450 women that died in the workplace. It's almost 1,000% more. And then the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence found that 1 in 3 women are the victims of some form of physical inter-partnered violence. That same organization finds that it's 1 in 4 for men. Yet men are underserved in resources and quality of care. By underserved, there are almost no domestic violence shelters that are only for men in the United States, or there's hundreds for women. And even those shelters that serve both men and women, men are often put up in hotels rather than the shelters for the safety of other people in those shelters. So even when a man is seeking help in crisis, he is still seen as a threat. And so when these issues aren't talked about, either in media or among people, they go unanswered. So questions of why the suicide rate for men is so high, there's not a lot of research into it. And so now why do I believe that this is happening? And so what I found is that this comes from society's lack of empathy towards male suffering and male loss of life in great numbers. And what I mean by lack of empathy, it's more of an indifference or an acceptance of this death as some sort of normal part of the way that our society works, or it's an acceptable loss. So looking back at those workplace fatalities, the 5 most dangerous jobs are logging, farming, roofing, construction, and ironworking. These groups are over 95% male. Today we live in a society where we're trying to push for gender equality, either in pay or in employment. But these groups, there is no societal push for that. We're okay with these high-risk workplaces being overwhelmingly male and these men taking these risks. Today, anybody can enlist in the military, but men are still the only group that are required to sign up for the draft. So at the age of 18, we expect men to fight and die for country and cause before they're even allowed to drink. And lastly, that suicide rate. 75% of suicide are men, but it's not considered a gendered issue. There's only a handful of studies as to why they commit suicide at a higher rate, to the point that there is no conclusive reason. And despite the fact that it is overwhelmingly male, we don't label it as a gendered issue or an issue for men. In comparison, domestic violence is a gendered issue. It's seen as a woman's issue, despite that the fact is that the difference between men and women in domestic violence is only about 10%, where suicide is 50%. And the last example I want to give is a little bit more of an extreme one, but it's to show that there is this lack of care about men's lives. In 2014, Boko Haram kidnapped around 300 girls at a Western Christian school in Nigeria. This made ripples around the world, with world leaders and important figures championing the phrase, bring back our girls. This was the first time that Boko Haram had made its way onto the mainstream Western media. It was seen as another story of another extremist group wanting to make sure that women and girls couldn't get an education. That's actually not true. They didn't want anybody to receive a Western Christian education, boys or girls. They saw Islam as the only education that people needed. But unfortunately, in the case of the girls, they were captured, and often of their attacks, they were either released and told to go home. The boys are often killed, usually burned alive. In the 3 years prior to these 2014 kidnappings, over 2,000 men and boys had been murdered. by this group. In the years prior to that, hundreds and thousands of more. And virtually no women were ever killed by Boko Haram. Yet, those killings and reports didn't make it to the mainstream media. We didn't talk about that. There was no world push to save the lives of these boys or to bring back our boys, because we didn't care. And even if we did, we couldn't bring them back because they were dead. So this idea that we don't seem to care about the lives of men cause more people to die. They don't seek help. When they don't seek help, they lose their lives. So I'm supposed to have some sort of solution to this problem. A lot of the times you think it's like, oh, legislation or more funding for resources. Those are kind of lofty, and seeing how we won't even have the conversation in our normal lives, that's not really gonna get us anywhere. So I think the simplest things that we can do is things that we can do in our daily lives. So whether that's just being there for the men in your lives, listening to them when they need help and when they need support, standing up against misandry. When you hear somebody say something derogatory to a man just because he's a man, stand against that. That's not fair. It's not cool. We've pitted each other against each other, genders against each other for far too long. So in conclusion, men have been suffering and have been dying at an unnatural rate, and we don't seem to talk about it. And the reasons for it is because we don't seem to care. And I want to change that we do care. I think it's imperative that we understand that we can recognize and advocate against the oppression of one gender while not disregarding the victimization of another. Make it normal to care about men and their suffering. Thank you.